Welcome to the HC Insider Podcast, a podcast dedicated to the commodities sector and the people within it. I'm your host, Paul Chapman. Today we're delighted to have Eirik Waerness on, Senior Vice President and Chief Economist at the global energy company Equinor, which itself is aiming to be a leader in the energy transition. However, that's a transition that is in no way easy, challenged by complexities across technologies, geographies, policy, and geopolitical volatility. And some of these challenges have yet really made it into public awareness. Even the most optimistic forecasts still see us going through 1.5 degrees centigrade increases in the coming years. In this episode, Eirik gives us an update on the European energy crisis and the coming winter, as well as looks broadly across the entire energy transition, complexities, opportunities and challenges that both the broader industry faces, as well as energy majors in particular. As always, you can support the show by leaving us a positive review on the platform you're listening on. It really does help support the show and expand it to a broader audience, and therefore allow us to continue to get great guests on to talk about all matters, topics and trends related to the energy and commodities world. And finally, I hope you enjoy the episode. Eirik, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Happy to join you.
So we're having a discussion around and using the terminology of a report that you put out, walls and bridges in the energy transition, and just really digging a little bit into the broader complexity and the lift that represents. However, it would be remiss if we didn't talk about this year and this coming winter, given your role as Chief Economist at Equinor. Where do we stand right now? I mean, the general sense is that a bit of a bullet was dodged winter 22-23, as it was warmer than expected, and we didn't see sort of the natural gas depleted as we could have done. Is there a bit of complacency in the market about 23? Where do we stand?
Yeah, I think definitely we're standing in a market which is still on the edge type of problems that could occur if events or weather or changes in the markets turn against us some way or the other. So it looks very well in terms of storage levels in Europe right now for gas. Prices have come significantly down and are relatively stable, and could even go further down for a while during the summer. Storage levels at the end of the winter season will, by all signals, be excellent. So then the question is, how does the next winter play out, both in terms of potential even further shortages in terms of the Russian gas volumes that actually come into Europe through the south, in terms of weather, which if it's very different than last winter, we will have a demand increase. In terms of manufacturing and other types of gas users, how are they able to continue to drive some reductions in demand? So there's a lot of uncertainty around it, but we did dodge a bullet. Some of the changes that took place in Europe in terms of both getting alternative sources of gas in was impressive, and then also the ability of the different types of demand centers to adjust their production and their demand, some behavioral changes as well in terms of indoor temperatures and so on was also pretty impressive. But you can't do that again forever.
Where do we stand sort of structurally? So a couple of comments. We don't know what the weather's going to be like, but last time we covered LNG on this podcast, look, there were significant new terminals being built to capture cargoes coming into Europe. Where do we stand there? And obviously, I guess, especially with the recent, when this episode goes out, who knows what might be going on in Russia. But, a couple of weekends ago, there was some significant events around Wagner and so forth. What percentage of Europe's gas still comes from that southern route from Russia? And is anyone giving any thought to that potentially being turned off if we do see a collapse?
Yeah, no, I guess we think that the likelihood of that southern route collapsing is fairly low, but it is, and I guess we're talking about 10-15% of European gas coming that way still, but of course the most impactful, or most of the impact from any event turning even worse than it is now, both in terms of the actual war, but also internally in Russia would also be more impacts in terms of risk premiums in any market. It would be impacts on the overall level of economic growth, et cetera, as well. In terms of where we stand structurally on other sources of supply, we have to remember that all the LNG that went to Europe last year and through the winter could have had alternative outlets. There was not that much of a supply increase in LNG last year. We expect supply to increase significantly over the next years, but it takes time. That's the supply that Europe was able to pull, could otherwise have gone to Asia. It didn't, because Asia couldn't afford to pay the same prices. And as a consequence, the use of coal picked up in countries in Asia that otherwise would have used slightly more gas. So CO2 emissions went up as well. And we just got the 2022 energy statistics out, and global CO2 emissions went up by close to 1%, driven by increased coal demand, increased oil demand that more than compensated for the reduction in gas demand.
Well, thanks for that. I think that gives us it's still on a finely balanced, as you say, and we could see volatility return quite quickly with one or two events and a cold forecast for the coming winter. It all feels quite long away as we're in the height of summer. But okay, so some of what you've highlighted there, this complexity, this shifting of energies, and one person capturing lower carbon energy consequently means in a world of increasing demand, other people are using more carbon intensive energy. We've covered that on coal episode itself. And that is the complexity around the energy transition. And your energy perspectives for this year put it in the context of walls and bridges. Can you, before we talk about sort of the various challenges, both structural and temporal, in achieving this, can you just help us understand some of the context and some of the goals? Because obviously Europe itself and many European companies have set up some really stringent targets around 2030 and 2050, all in the context of trying to prevent, major rises in temperature. But already there's this feeling that kind of the lower goals of 1.5 degrees Celsius we're just going to go through them. Can you just set us some goals in terms of what people are trying to achieve with respect to temperatures and what that might mean in terms of emissions?
Yeah, well, this is building on climate science and the reports from the International Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, with the associated costs of expected costs, if you like, expected consequences of different types of temperature increase towards 2100. And this is about reducing the carbon, avoiding the carbon concentration in the atmosphere to continue to increase, and then ultimately taking it down again if we were to overshoot some of these thresholds, right? So that's where you're coming from. And then we have a carbon budget that is believed to be consistent with different types of temperature increases towards 2100. And one number that is out there is the 450 parts per million of carbon concentration, which should be in line with a 1.5 degree temperature increase with a 50% probability. And then in order to get there, you have to at some point stop carbon emissions total. You have to go to zero, because as long as carbon emissions continue to be positive, the CO2 concentration in the atmosphere will continue to rise for long periods, because the impact of CO2 in the atmosphere stays there for many, many years. So as long as CO2 emissions are positive, which they are significantly, and especially if they continue to increase, then we will not reach these ambitions. And with carbon concentrations at current levels, we have in our forecast scenario, which we call walls, come back to that, we have the world passing the threshold for the 1.5 degree target warming already in around 10 years, early in the 2030s. And that's a scenario that contains a lot of energy transition and changes, and a lot of energy and climate policies as well. It's definitely not a business as usual scenario, but we still pass that threshold. So that means that the urgency of doing this and at the same time the necessity of having to do this in a world that will continue to grow in terms of GDP, purchasing power, population, and in order to do it in a just way it becomes even more difficult the longer we wait, if you like.
Yeah. So there's so much in that, and I know from obviously our prior discussions to starting to recording, like the the deep complexity here, and it's amazing in some senses how little of that complexity is understood more broadly in the public and so forth, and almost how sort of talking about some of this complexity, a lot of it sits outside of the energy industry itself, right? When we're going to come on to talk about permitting and so forth. There's sort of almost now a sort of a heresy-like response if someone sort of highlights it, even in the context of very ambitious goals like you've just mentioned. But let's talk about sort of in the context of that, the walls and bridges, walls being the slowing, the disconnecting of how this is achieved, and the bridges essentially being the best case scenario where everything's really motoring. First of all, let's start on, I guess, the easier stuff. Where are we at in kind of that levelized cost of energy of renewables against conventionals, and is that a battle that's still being won? Can you talk to that first?
Yeah, well, on levelized cost of energy, I guess the short-term development here has gone in to some extent in the wrong direction for parts of the technologies because of the supply chain issues and the bottlenecks that we're facing, the cost increases, the underlying inflation. But still, you see that things like large-scale solar and electricity, and to some extent also parts of the wind spectrum as well can very well compete at the margin with other sources of electricity. But the problem with levelized cost of energy estimates is that you don't take into account the full system costs, right? So you have to think about the larger electricity system run on intermittent sources. You need backup, you need storage, you need balancing systems, you need more grids. So and all that has to happen. It's also about but definitely on renewable electricity, the development goes very fast. It goes in the right direction, fortunately. We're spending now, according to IEA, we're spending $1.7 on clean energy for every dollar we spend on investing in fossil fuels. That's good news for the ability to provide an alternative to fossil fuels that would allow consumers then to reduce their demand. We will not change from fossil fuels as consumers until we have an alternative. And in order to provide that alternative, we need massive investments in those alternatives. On the electricity side, that is going in the right direction, but not with significant or sufficient speed. IEA also told us that if we're to get there, the investment quotient, if you like, will have to be 1 to 9. So for every dollar spent on fossil fuels, we would have to spend $9 by 2030 on different investments in the clean energy space. And that's just to provide much more electricity, and then we have to incentivize the move towards more electricity. And that's about moving people away from molecules, using gas for heating. So you use electricity for heating, etc. And of course, these are slow processes by nature. Capital equipment that we use when we use energy has long lifetimes. So we have to wait, if you like, until somebody decides to invest in a new type of equipment until we then evaluate the alternatives. Replacing a furnace in a steel plant with something that can run on hydrogen instead of coal, that will happen once we have the hydrogen available, but it would also have to wait to happen until we are in a situation where we have to replace that furnace. So there's also the long lead times, the long lifetimes, if you like. It takes a while. We just had the news of a very large contract for new aircraft being ordered by Air India from Airbus. That's 500 new planes being delivered around 2025 and onwards. Those planes will be using liquid fuels for very, very long. And they will fly for 20, 25 years onwards, right? So that's one of an energy system that grows, that has long lead times. So all the good news on electricity will have to be balanced against the stickiness, the slow moving of this super tanker of a global energy system that keeps growing.
We've covered this angle quite a few times, both in kind of the micro detail around the specific supply chains for batteries or whatever it might be. But on a broader scale, when we turn out to the supply chain to convert, as you say, that entire energy infrastructure to an electron economy, there's sort of these two issues, if you'd like, that I see. One is the nature of those supply chains and where they sit. from a geopolitical competition, etc., etc. And I think this week there was a huge report about just the scale and momentum that Chinese renewables have had, and the contribution to electricity production there. Obviously, lots of those supply chains sit in China. Secondly, it's just the sheer scale of the lift as well that is probably going to take a lot more time than we expect. Just this sheer amount, volumes of new infrastructure, of materials that need to be mined. We sort of see Robert Friedland call the clarion call on copper each day on social media, etc. Can you just give us a few words around that piece?
Yeah, that is definitely something that we should be concerned with. It's one of the things that have to happen here is a significant scale up of the total global capacity to mine rare earth elements, process, refine, and transport them in as an energy efficient way as possible. And you have to do that within the context of some of these resources that we need are concentrated geographically prone to geopolitical conflict in and by themselves. There's a potential for the owners of these resources to monopolize them or dominate them. Indonesia has, for an example, called for a cartel like OPEC on nickel. We just had the Chilean administration tell us that they were thinking about nationalizing their lithium resources. Probably won't happen, but it's a signal that dominant players here will play a role in a world where we are still in a situation of geopolitical tension. The dominance of China in some of these, the whole supply chain of this, which goes all the way from mining to their control of mining, to the control of the processing and refining, and then the ultimate production of the equipment as well, is one issue. But if you think about the need to increase the output of many of these resources 5 to 10 times, so 5 to 10-fold increase over the next 15 years, it's also pretty clear that we can, even in a situation where we geopolitically trusted China and where we were in a very benign situation, we probably couldn't rely on China to provide all of that for us, because their capacity to produce these things, their demographic dividend is not what it used to be. They're a middle income country. They won't be the cheapest place to do this. So we would have to look elsewhere anywhere, which is what the Inflation Reduction Act in the United States also stimulates, right? So this is about finding ways to do this as efficiently as possible, finding the right resources, the density of the mineral business in terms of how much usable material that you take out of a mine compared to the total amount of mass you take out is very low, right? So this is about finding resources with sufficient density as well, that it can be useful for us. We will probably have to start looking for minerals on the sea bottom as well, and then it has to be done sustainably. We have to think about the energy use in the whole process here. So this will happen. It is happening, but the challenge of making it happen at sufficient scale and speed is one of the things that I worry about.
What is fascinating just struck me when you talk about sort of this idea of setting up cartels around nickel and stuff. The technologies aren't also set either, right? I mean, if one particular metal becomes prohibitively expensive, we are going to just move to different chemistries like LFPs, for example. I think it might be a bit early to start trying to corner markets here, but it does bring us on to this interesting, almost philosophical context of the amount of energy consumed in the West, and China we should throw in there now as well. Their carbon footprint's pretty high. It's vastly higher than the global south. So it's also this idea of how do you, to achieve a just transition, you've got to sort of essentially push some of that energy use over to the global south and consequently lower it in the developed West. And so that is a mind-bogglingly challenging task from a policy standpoint, from a behavioral standpoint, from a human condition standpoint. Can you just talk to us and help us understand sort of how energy would need to shift around the world to get to these goals?
Yeah, I know. I think, and that's also one of the ethical issues around this as well. It's and there's a reason why we have 17 Sustainable Development Goals, and number 1 being the elimination of poverty, and number 10 being the elimination or the reduction of income inequalities. And the reason why we use much more energy in the West compared to the global South is not that we are energy inefficient. It's because we're so much richer than they are. per capita GDP in the industrialized countries on average is 25 times higher, at least, than that of the average per capita GDP in Africa, as an example. That's why we use much more energy. And then the problem becomes, if you want to do something about a just transition, what that would entail is an income transfer, a significant financing exercise or an income transfer, reduced purchasing power, if you like, in the West and towards the global South. Possibilities of growth, consumption growth, with associated increases in energy demand and the ability to transit quickly to renewable energy, sustainable energy. But in doing that, in a situation now where the energy efficiency is much lower in the poor parts of the world relative to rich parts of the world. So for every dollar we move out of the West, we reduce our energy demand somewhat as a consequence of that. But then the dollar is being used in the poor parts of the world where the energy efficiency is only 1/3 of what it is in the West. That would lead to an increase in energy demand, that move in itself. And given that fossil fuels are still dominating, we're still talking about 80% of the global energy mix being fossil, that leads to emission increases. And as a consequence, we can't reach the climate targets because we're going to, or at least we're going to do an overshoot, which makes it more difficult to bring the emissions further down again. So, and that's one of what we call the ultimate dilemma here, is that achieving a just transition within the context of extremely tight carbon budgets is very, very difficult.
What's the wall? I mean, that's the wall. What's the bridge there? I mean, which body tackles this, and how do you tackle that?
Well, I don't have the answer to that, to be honest, because in our bridges scenario, where we stay within the 1.5 degree target, we show what that takes. We think it is technically possible, but it is not very probable, especially since it requires a type of global cooperation and finding smart common solutions in a scale and speed which is very, very difficult to see right now. But in that scenario, we do achieve the emission reductions, but we have to admit that we do not do wonders for reducing per capita income differentials between the poor and the rich. We tried that a couple of years back, where we had a conscious choice of assumptions where we allowed per capita GDP to grow significantly faster in the emerging economies and pull down the growth, if you like, in the industrialized world as a way of signaling that would potentially be part of the financing agreement within the Paris Agreement. When we tried that, we ended up with a scenario that would deliver something like a 1.7 degree warming, 1.8. So that is that, and I don't think a lot of other scenarios that are consistent with these tightest climate targets have a solution for that.
I was going to say, well, that's especially when you sort of earlier on you talked about the longevity of this infrastructure, right? All of the second-hand cars from the West go to the global South, and the same with all the rest of the equipment, yes. Right? So we're already in that. My point being, there's already this sort of inertia built into the system. Yeah,
there is.
The other massive wall, which again seems like, especially we covered this in the context of the US, but this permitting and the thing you said to me, the world has gone from NIMBYism, not in my backyard, to banana. Can you talk to that one?
Yeah, well, it's probably, it is a joke and it's probably not relevant all over the place, but a banana is an acronym for build absolutely nothing anywhere near anything. And from NIMBYism, where we worried about having infrastructure, pipelines, wind turbines, solar panels, gas and oil pipelines for that matter, trunk lines for power in our own backyard or nearby where we live or work or stay. A banana type of world also is reflecting the fact that people that do not live in our neighborhood are also concerned with the type of investments, the type of environmentally infringing, if you like, capital equipment put in place to provide energy or infrastructure. And that has to be overcome, because what we're facing here is something that is in many ways capital intensive. It is also providing electricity efficiently means that the production of electricity should take place relatively close to the use of that electricity, because transporting electricity over long distances are still inefficient and costly. So that would mean that you have the wind power towers, the wind turbines, the solar parks, and so on, relatively close to population centers for a while. This is about then, and it's about increasing the size of the grid, both local and regional grids. It's about building pipelines for hydrogen transport, CO2 transport, etc., etc. Permitting processes for these types of investments typically take a while, and there are very good reasons for that. This is about democratic processes. This is about taking into consideration relevant environmental concerns. Transporting electricity from a wind turbine in the North Sea through a UNESCO protected wetland area on the coast of one of the neighboring countries, and then putting in place a hydrogen factory, electrolysis factory on that coastline, has environmental consequences for animals and for wetlands. And those types of processes typically take a long time to get through, right? And then that has changed a bit in Germany now in terms of regasification terminals, because they urgently needed that to be able to bring the LNG ashore. And then you go through a federal state like the United States, a federal country like the United States, or Germany for that matter, also being a federal state. There are several layers of decision-making processes that you have to handle. And that slows this down. Building a trunk line of electricity through Germany from north to the south typically takes 5 to 8 years to get through, just the permitting and then investing. With the carbon budget notion, that is what is, in a sense, we don't have time to wait for that.
Yeah.
and that has consequences.
It's fascinating, isn't it? Because there is this dichotomy, this internal tension between a carbon budget and broader environmental degradation goals, right? Because it's not just putting solar parks next to communities, it's also allowing digging out the sides of mountains in Utah and Colorado or the Carpathians or whatever it might be. There's a whole supply chain that's needed, and all of that is going to create environmental degradation. And that is, that is where you come to the policy side, the planning side, where they're looking at both angles, and it's there's almost this tyranny of the carbon budget, and I just don't feel like the public awareness has caught up with that we are going to have to make these trade-offs, sacrifice both as individuals and as groups. And good to get you to talk to that, but also, where does nuclear fit in on this? It just strikes me that sort of sits sort of ground zero of this permitting challenge and this conflict, this internal challenge between, yes, environmental degradation, storage issues, all of this, mining the uranium and so forth, but actually in terms of carbon goals, it fits really nicely.
Yes, it does. No, and to be fair, I mean, what we have to look at is, of course, that continuing with a fossil-dominated energy mix also would require significant investments, some of which also have the same type of concerns, but typically much more energy per unit invested. So you don't have the same local footprint often, and then the same goes for nuclear. It's costly, it's risky, at least the perception is that it's risky. It has a relatively low area footprint per kilowatt hour produced, but so far it's taken forever to build the most recent nuclear power plants of scale in Europe. There are very clear political decisions that we want to reduce that capacity, and then what do we do? But of course, I mean, we think that we need significantly more nuclear in order to balance the electricity mix, or to make that at least less challenging in the future, because you get that base load type of electricity production from nuclear, and then you have less of the energy demand that has to be served by more intermittent sources that you can't control. And doing that requires a massive change, both in policy and the willingness to do it. We will also have to develop the technology in terms of these so-called small modular reactors that everybody's talking about, but we haven't seen a lot of yet.
No.
And the existing nuclear fleet, both in the United States, in Europe, and somewhere else, is getting very old.
Yeah, 40 years is the average. We had
typically, when did we last build a nuclear facilities. So increasing nuclear generation, which most likely will have to happen in Asia, but also in the Middle East, but at a global level, also means you have to take account of reducing the capacity or the generation from the existing fleet, because that has to be phased out. So you have to replace the existing fleet plus build new stuff in order to have more nuclear globally in 2050 than we have today.
Yeah, there are obviously hopefully some technological advances with using salts rather than water, all that good stuff, which we will be covering, which is exciting, right? But again, it's interesting, isn't it? Because, you said, well, it's obviously the permitting, how long it takes, but also the risk, and then it's no actually perceived risk. It's again the sort of the sacrifices and the public awareness that needs to be built in order for this transition to happen, and I just don't see it.
The HC Insider podcast is brought to you by HC Group, a retained search, intelligence and advisory firm focused solely on the global energy and commodity sector. With 6 locations across Asia, Europe and the Americas and over 50 consultants. To find out more, go to our website, hcgroup.global. There, you can also sign up for our HC Insider content for more interviews and white papers on relevant trends and talent impacts in the commodities world.
Okay, but so far we've really been talking about things that are common, I think, to everywhere, and essentially every sort of supply chain involved. You then throw all this into a world where you've got attempted coups by Wagner, you've got a pretty powerful OPEC, you've got all of this. We're going from sort of a unipolar world and a very globalized world of the 90s and the 2000s into quite a different environment suddenly, where we are in deglobalization. We're seeing that destabilizing trade routes, policy uncertainty. I mean, goodness knows what a change in administration in the US would do to the IRA, and obviously that's a factor companies had to be thinking about. So there's so much volatility in policies out there, and then all these geostrategic challenges. Can you talk to that? And that must be a front and foremost of thought for most of the oil majors like Equinor when they're thinking about how do they participate in this transition.
Yeah, no, it's a part of our surroundings. It leads to relatively cautious evaluations, if you like, of different types of risks that we have to deal with when we put money down for new investments in either in regions that might be prone to instability or to changing trade flows, changing trade policies. It's about the future of markets many years after we've started investing. In a world where we don't trade with each other or with someone that we don't like or don't trust, we do not exchange technology, we do not openly give away good solutions that we have found to someone else. Part of the research that is needed here is like a public good, in a sense that somebody has to take on the cost of this, and then once you figure it out, then it should be shared with a lot of other players after a period of patents or whatever. And if that doesn't happen because we don't trust the counterparty, the development here will be slower than it otherwise would have been. And that's why we think in a scenario where we are actually achieving some of these climate targets, that can only take place at sufficient speed in a world that is very benign. And of course, that is very far away from where we are now. So we will have to deal. A lot of good things will happen because we will also see that, for instance, security of supply and decarbonization and affordability, those 3 elements of the energy trilemma, are not always in a trilemma. You can actually achieve decarbonization and increased security of supply in some parts of the world by using your own domestic resources, moving away from imported coal or imported gas to domestically generated renewable electricity. Then you can achieve both, because some of these most of the renewable energy sources are very local. But in other parts of the world, that's not the case. And then in a world where we don't trust each other, then that will slow down the development relative to what is needed.
I mean, it prima facie makes sense for Europe, right? But then you sort of throw in the supply chains to actually build the batteries and so forth, and you've got a lot of tentacles there that are in competition, particularly in resources in Africa and so forth. But as you say, that trilemma for the US, it's just, well, we're not going to touch renewables. We're just going to stick with our vast reserves of hydrocarbons, for example. It is
but they can also be turned. Hydrocarbons can be turned into carbon-free sources of energy once you take away the carbon, right? Through carbon capture and storage and so on. But that is part of it. I think the Inflation Reduction Act in the United States will gradually have significant impact also on the energy mix in the United States. But it's going to cost money, and the results will come once we have sort of overcome the consequence of a very long and large scale deindustrialization, both in North America and in Europe. We've moved a lot of the global production capacity to East Asia. And anything we will do here in the energy transition is something we have to build. Large part of it contains a lot of steel. And bringing that back, that capacity to manufacture stuff, is urgently needed. Also because we need more of it, so we cannot rely only on Asian supply chains to the same extent we have, and it will take time, and we'll have to have people go back into working and investing in manufacturing jobs after having a long period of deindustrialization in both in not all parts of Europe, but in parts of Europe and in large parts of the United States as well.
Yeah. Pull all those financial advisors who are coming up against the 5% interest rate back to work.
Yeah,
might have to cut that. So I guess throughout this we talked about sort of this dilemma of public awareness, or trilemma even, of public awareness, the tragedy of the commons and sort of the public good, and then kind of the individual's behaviours who still want to have the nicest cars with the nicest trims and all of the material consequences of that. It still feels to me like there is a lot of simplicity in thinking. And, you spoke about energy security. I mean, it's fascinating how quickly the world was reminded of that, and thinking shifted back from almost sort of a utopian-like thinking, in the consequence of the pandemic, to suddenly realizing, inflation, food security, energy security, and they're almost one and the same, as Doomberg points out. Energy security is always going to take primacy, right? And it both in the household and at the country level. And, any kind of geopolitical shocks that come along vastly delay the transition for just that reason. Yes.
And I mean, we have large parts of the world that do not have any energy security, and that's the energy poor parts of the world. And where family members will have to spend most of the day to find water and wood to provide the necessary energy to cook food in the evening. And then the focus on energy security among us in the richest parts of the world is such that we're reacting extremely to lack of energy, to security, or to threats of blackouts or whatever it is, and because it threatens our economy, it threatens our ability to make the wheels go round, it threatens our ability to solve issues, to communicate, to travel, and then there is how do we change that, and how do we make ourselves more resilient to using less energy? And that's a lot about energy efficiency. It's to some extent replacing fossil fuels with electricity in, for instance, transport. I mean, at the end user level, you then use much less energy. Than an electric vehicle is much more efficient than an internal combustion engine car in the end user part of the chain. There are examples of we have a Western European lifestyle in many ways uses much less energy than an American lifestyle. If you compare the cities of Barcelona and Atlanta, they're roughly the same size in terms of people, but the energy use in Barcelona is 1/3 of that of Atlanta. And I would wager that the quality of life is at least as high in Barcelona as in Atlanta, but the lifestyles are very, very different in terms of size of houses, distances traveled, etc., and means of transportation, if you like.
Yeah, but that's fascinating, isn't it? Because we don't have time to talk about it here, really. But firstly, it depends. Does efficiency have a champion, or do you have true end user price signals that allow changes in behaviours, which you don't? Gas is very much a domestic policy issue for the Biden administration. It's also a consequence of policies. I mean, this crazy idea that sedan cars get taxed more than SUVs because SUVs are trucks, and all of that's. I just driven around the UK, and the car I rented, which was a nice car, was unavailable at that engine size. In fact, the whole model's just unavailable in the US because the engine's too small. Right? I think it's like a 1.8
The same car has a much
the same car has a
5 liter much smaller engine.
Yeah. But that aside,
exactly.
Lots of challenges there. Can you just the other bit of this is sort of the output of this is obviously those temperatures, and we've kind of alluded that in your wall scenario, which basically is the current scenario, even with an optimistic slant on it, I would argue, is we're going through 1.5 degrees. These things aren't all so linear.
Yeah, no, of course, and that's but if we take the emission trajectory and the accumulated emissions in our wall scenario, it's very far away from being a typical business as usual scenario. You can say that it's IPCC's data points and forecasts indicate that such a scenario is a 2.2 degree scenario if we go all the way out to 2100. Which is much better than what we thought some years back. It's also much better than the UN most recent expected scenario. So it's very far away from being a business as usual. It's a 50% improvement in annual energy efficiency development, as an example. It's basically about a global economy in 2050 being almost twice the size of the current global economy, but not using more primary energy. So we're able to satisfy the energy demand of about 2 billion more people in an economy that is twice as large as now, but using the same amount of energy, primary energy, as we do today. So there's a massive energy transition going on there as well, and that's in spite of these geopolitical consequences. And I think that illustrates also very much that all the talk about reaching these climate ambitions and climate targets, we should not let that end up being where the best outcome ends up being the enemy of the good, because all the things that are taking place in the wall scenario are good and they're moving us in the right direction, and we just need to do more of them. So we shouldn't despair in a sense, but we have to also have a serious conversations of some of the other dilemmas here. How do we address other sustainable development goals? How do we reduce inequalities if we're concerned with that? There's something about the overall use of resources from a finite planet. And then it's about balancing those different
as you said, even in that wall scenario, there is a significant change across all of these challenges that we've highlighted, right? Whether it's policies, permitting, globalization, technologies, the trade-offs inherent in environmental degradation versus carbon reduction. What if the world sort of continues really as we've seen the last 2 years, which is essentially increasing carbon emissions? What does that scenario play out like? Is that sort of, the 4 degree scenario in the next 20 years is sort of unthinkable?
Yeah, I think the likelihood of a scenario that has a carbon concentration equivalent to 3.5 to 4.5 degree warming by 2100, that scenario is very unlikely, and it has the development over the last years have signaled that is something we shouldn't worry too much about. But of course we have to make sure that we continue the type of development we've seen over the last years, and then try to increase the speed of that. There's a lot of improvement that will now come from some of the technological improvements that we've seen over the last decades. The EV penetration in new car sales in China will have an impact, as an example. But the worry is, of course, that it's not going to happen sufficiently quickly, and you can get setbacks, partly because we don't have, by eliminating Russia from anything in terms of international trade and exchange of good ideas, we've also taken away 1/9 of the world's landmass as a source of carbon sinks, as a source of minerals, as a source of energy. That means that delivering on some of these things will be harder than it otherwise would have been. And I think we should always prepare for surprises. The good news is that human beings will be smarter going forward. We will still have good ideas. There will be productivity development. There will be purchasing power increases as a consequence of that, but there will also be solutions found that we can't think about any yet, right? And both in terms of energy efficiency, demand management, ultimately the macroeconomic benefits of digitalization. Once we understand how to do that without increasing the use of electricity too much, right?
Yeah.
Because that's one of the paradoxes, is that some of these digital
AI
solutions, they use massive amounts of energy.
Yeah.
Bitcoin mining is the most extreme and useless example, I guess. But
it's still
also,
those GPUs are whether you're using it to mine Bitcoins or whether you're using it for an AI query, they're incredibly energy intensive. And we've actually got Chris Miller on talking about chip wars coming up and some of that aspects. Okay, just a final couple of points, and I'm finding this fascinating. One is, of course, that a lot of this heavy lifting is reliant on the global energy majors, right? And transforming themselves, kind of using the NBA analogy from sort of the coach and carriage company into the car company, right? Making that transition. There's also an ambivalence to how they're being treated, right? In sense of they need a war chest to be able to accomplish and invest in these technologies that also have a lower IRR, which is another challenge to that, right? You know, it's a very different economic output from the liquid gold that is finding oil offshore compared to solar parks, but also in a time when we're seeing windfall taxes and are trying to reduce that war tax and a public outcry against them solving the energy problems of the last year, right? I mean, it seems that's a real challenge as well.
Yeah, and I think it's the challenge that the global, or the parts of the global energy industry that is listed on Western exchanges, right? I mean, both the European and the American majors, and with some other companies also, and some of the national energy companies as well from Asia as well. It's a challenge that is being taken very seriously. It's a challenge where we see the absolute necessity for companies like ours, a sector like ours, to go in and try and do something about it. Use our capacity, our knowledge, our experience, our capital to gradually shift the investments. We have the knowledge of doing investments in many different countries, both onshore and offshore. We have the project management type of capability. We have the links to the supplier industry where we can bring with us the ones that we need to put in place the necessary investments. There's a lot of similarities between a pipeline, between different pipelines, irrespective of whether it transports oil, gas, or ultimately hydrogen, et cetera, et cetera. And then, of course, there's a risk-reward type of a judgment that has to be made here. And for some of these projects where we need a government subsidy to make them sufficiently profitable, or we need a guarantee for price to make it investable, then also part of that will eliminate some of the risks and therefore make it possible for us to accept a slightly lower unadjusted rate of return. So the risk-reward balance might be acceptable at the margin. But there's also something, of course, then about being put in a position where we actually can do this while we continue to provide the necessary oil and gas, and coal for that matter, but in particular oil and gas for the international oil and gas companies. If we were to completely shift our investments immediately, the world would run out of oil and gas. Supply would fall faster than any demand projection. And as I said earlier, we need to provide the alternatives for consumers or users of energy so that they can reduce their demand for fossil fuels before we reduce that supply. And that's a very difficult balance now with handling activists and activist shareholders, striking the right balance of providing a credible energy transition plan, making the necessary investments in low carbon solutions and renewables in a situation where we frankly don't have enough projects. We don't have places to put these money in large parts of the developing world, as an example, in emerging economies. One of the frustrations is that the money doesn't go there. What we're dealing with are projects in North America and in Europe to a large extent that are investable, where there's been a lot of competition for participating in those and where the returns have been bid down. So we need more projects. We need more possibilities, and we need that in countries where the institutions are lacking, where the tax systems are immature, where the electricity markets are unregulated or non-existing, where there's no grid, etc., etc. So, and that's why some of the frustrations for us is how much of that are we able to do over the next 5 to 10 years, while we still continue to provide essential oil and gas to a world that definitely will continue to need it for quite a while.
Yeah, it's so it's very insightful what you say about, of course, the global south, the rest of the world, the developing world, doesn't have the necessary structures and so forth for you to go into them from a legal standpoint, from a property rights standpoint, from an infrastructure standpoint. And that's incredible risk. Oil majors are used to taking these types of risks and they're best prepared to do it. But if the financing and investment isn't flowing to you, you've got pressure, the Just Stop Oil stuff and so on, wearing their vinyl orange jackets made from oil, having driven there in a car made, et cetera, et cetera. Anyway, that aside.
Yeah, no, and I said, but and also that on this need for oil and gas. I mean, even in our 1.5 degree scenario, the bridges scenario, we have oil demand, like IEA, by the way, in 2050 still at 25 million barrels per day.
Yeah.
And out of that, roughly 80% of that remaining oil demand, so 20 million barrels per day, is expected to go as feedstock into the global petrochemical industry.
And it will be a lot more expensive by then, right? We had Joel Cousson from the IEA talking about their sort of forward range planning. And it's just not going to be the history of transitions is one of increasing volatility, et cetera, et cetera. Just one final comment. I know we're running on a little bit on this one, but I find it fascinating. With your Economist hat on, and I better get the definition right so Nassim Taleb, if he's listening, doesn't write in. But there are these black swans, and I've just finished reading Peter Frankopan's book, The Earth Transformed, which is all about sort of the interplay of climate change and civilization. And sort of the consequent concerns of civilizations about climate change, which has been ever present too. And if anyone knows Peter Frankopan, I'd love to have him on. But there are these black swans, low probability but really high impact events. Is there any of those in your forward planning?
Yeah, we call some of them black swans and some of them key uncertainties that would potentially have a slightly higher probability, but also relatively high impact that we have not included, if you like, in our scenarios. And things like a tighter, tougher geopolitical stance between the large powers in the world leading to an armed conflict would of course upend and change a lot of the things that we're talking about here. We have not included a true breakthrough for fusion energy, in the sense that it would be scalable and visible in the global electricity and / energy mix already by 2040. That's a low probability, but a high impact type of event if it were to happen. Mass migration has very large impact both on the region from which people migrate and for the regions to which people migrate. And we haven't done a lot of that in terms of population movements and so on. And that could be caused by climate change or water shortage or food or war. So that's a type of event that we haven't included. One of the key uncertainties that we're focusing on is because we do not really know a lot about where it will bring us, but that's the continued development of artificial intelligence in a world where some of the framework conditions for regulating it are not there, just like they're not for climate change. So, a world of geopolitical conflict, a democratic deficit that is larger than any time in the last 40 years. So they're about relatively concentrated or massively concentrated powers in a few business leaders. That combination is not very conducive to regulation of artificial intelligence, and therefore, what would an unregulated development of artificial intelligence potentially entail, both in terms of energy use, consequences for humanity, consequences for jobs, etc., etc. So that's something we're thinking about, at least. And then you can, of course, think about many others.
Well, and we're already seeing the US banning NVIDIA selling higher powered GPUs to China as a result of concerns over that. Yeah. I mean, I mentioned the Earth Transformed. I didn't really finish that thought because obviously one of the things that is unpredictable, but has been the major driver of climate change throughout human history typically shifting climate, cooling dramatic cooling, has been volcanoes. And
Super cool. And I had a few years back, or some years back, that was on my list of potential black swans, was an eruption of one of the super volcanoes, Yellowstone being one of them. If and when that happens,
we might be pleased to have a couple of degrees extra warming.
Well, it's I remember myself, some of the coldest winters in my lifetime were the winters of 1981, 82, 83, after the Mount St. Helens erupted. That's of course that was a relatively small event compared to, but that is it's not very easy to predict, and it happens when it happens, in a sense, right?
Yeah, just to add to the doom and gloom. But anyway, okay, well, Eirik, it's been really really interesting having you on. I'd love to revisit in a year and see where we stand. And I don't think it's not like we've spoken solutions, but I think highlighting and sort of starting the discourse around this myriad challenges that it all faces, and frankly, the global leadership it's going to need that just isn't present at the moment. I don't feel to push some of these things through. It's got its headwinds.
Yeah, it does. But on the other hand, I mean, I'm now leaving to go home because it's the afternoon here, and I'm going to travel with the public transportation on an electric bus, and so in micro environments we see some of the necessary solutions here, both in terms of electricity, more electricity use, more use of electric transport, compact cities where we don't have to travel as much. They're all there, but it's just about scaling it up, handling the growth in energy demand at the same time, the economic growth and the necessary change in lifestyles.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of room for optimism as well, but and we shouldn't let the best become the enemy of the good. We just have to continue working with the good solutions.
Yeah. Meanwhile, I've been told on text multiple times that I need to leave the house because they struck a main gas line outside, which is pumping thousands of cubic feet of natural gas into the air. So, your electric bus ride has just been offset dramatically by the actions of people on Kipling Street. Anyway, well,
good luck with that. Take care. Get out of the house.
It's been good to talk, Eirik.
Take care.
Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this episode and want to support the show, please give us a positive review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. To find out more about HC Insider and HC Group, a search and advisory firm dedicated to the commodity markets, visit our website at www.hcgroup.global. There you can find out more about our services and our offices around the world. There you can also find more content, from interviews to insight pieces to more podcasts focused on the commodity value chains. Thanks again for listening.